I'm Janice Fiyamengo of the University of Ottawa. One of the major effects of feminism has been to create a false narrative of history, such that the entirety of the human past is seen to be a story of women as innocent victims and men as privileged oppressors. Even those who consider themselves well-educated tend to accept that women have struggled heroically and against great odds for their basic human rights. I accepted this version of history myself for many years because that's what I was taught. Even when I was writing a PhD thesis on women journalists, no one challenged my version of women struggling for their rights. Take, for example, the right to vote. Most of us know that sometime in the early 20th century, the year was 1918 in Britain and Canada and 1919 in the United States, women finally won the right to vote. Now, to many, this seems flabbergasting. Proof of patriarchal oppression, that it took so long for men to concede this basic right of citizenship to women. Imagine that, we think, 100 years ago our foremothers couldn't vote. For all those centuries, men were denying it to them. Except that it isn't true. The franchise hadn't been a basic right of citizenship throughout history. Historically speaking, it was a relatively recent idea that citizens should elect their governments. And for much of the period that feminists tell us indignantly that women weren't eligible to vote, most men weren't. To the period that feminists tell us indignantly that women weren't eligible to vote, most men weren't eligible either. So to say that women were not allowed to vote throughout history is like saying that they weren't allowed to flap their wings and fly. Almost no one, including women themselves, thought they should. And by the way, here's a question that I heard Jonathan Taylor ask at a conference I attended last year. Jonathan is the author of the website A Voice for Male Students. His question was this: who was more oppressed in 1917? The woman who couldn't vote, or the man who was sent to the trenches of World War I to have his guts ripped out? Good question. I think it's a crucial context to keep in mind when we hear about male privilege in earlier times. But the situation is even more complex in the British and Canadian contexts, because the fact is that a good number of those men who went to have their guts ripped out in the trenches of France and Belgium were not even themselves qualified to vote. It's almost unbelievable, but true. Before 1918, the vote was restricted in Great Britain and Canada by property and income-based qualifications that prevented large numbers of working men from voting. It was only during the second half of the 19th century, particularly with the legislative reforms of 1867 and 1884, that a series of laws progressively extended voting rights to a larger and larger percentage of men. After 1832, about 1 in 5 men had the right to vote. Almost half of adult males, though, were still not eligible to vote when they accepted the call to fight and die for their country in the First World War. So in other words, it wasn't until 1918 that the right to vote was extended not only to women, which of course we hear a great deal about, but to all. It wasn't until 1918 that the right to vote was extended not only to women, which of course we hear a great deal about, but to all men. So how can this be that this part of the story is almost completely unknown? How come when we celebrate the extension of the franchise to women, we don't talk about its extension to poor and working class men? And how come when we discuss women's suffrage activism, we don't mention the crucial fact that before 1867, the vast majority of even middle-class men were barred from the franchise, and therefore that those men who were enfranchised in 1867 had this privilege for only about 4 decades before it was granted to women. In other words, on a historical timescale, the enfranchisement of men barely preceded that of women. Well, we don't talk about these realities because feminists have rewritten history and we've bought the story. Feminists want us to see men of the past as oppressive and uncaring, as denying women what was rightfully theirs and living it up in one endless party of privilege and power. Such a version of the past does an injustice to the dead and an even more serious injustice to living men whose problems and suffering it licenses feminists to ignore. It's time to get real about our history and to stop using a false narrative to justify feminism's exclusionary ideology.